I, for one, am welcoming September and what they call meteorological fall. They call it that because this is when we're supposed to start experiencing those fall weather patterns even before that first day of autumn is upon us. Does anybody remember those fall weather patterns? Anyone remember what that was like? Meteorological fall. We're ready. Anytime now would be just great, wouldn't it? It's coming. I think this is one of those times where it's okay not to necessarily live in the present moment because those days are coming. They're on their way. And other than the heat, I will say that there are a lot of different reasons to make me happy to see August in the rearview mirror. Because it seemed like, I think every other week during August, something happened in the world that made me want to abandon my talk topic. I was thinking about that as all the Ku Klux Klan and Nazi ugliness was happening in Charlottesville, but I figured I'd wait until September and address some of those issues then, which is what we're going to do. And then along comes Harvey at the end of the month to provide a tragic, but I think relevant bookend, or maybe a better way to look at it is to call it a counterpoint to Charlottesville, because we go from Charlottesville with its disgusting white nationalism promoting hate and more division to this amazing example of how people come together in the face of a natural disaster. And it brings us face to face with this really important question of why does it take something so destructive to get our attention and force us to realize that we are all in the same boat.
Yes.
Literally. I'm going to let these next slides go by slowly here so you get a little opportunity to take in some of the pictures that have been out here in the past week. Pause on that one. We insult them, they offer help. All I can say is that Mexico has far too much integrity to let a stupid wall get in the way of doing the right thing. The title for this series this month, The Quest for Peace and Justice, it comes from the title of a lecture that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave back in 1964 when he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize. Most of us I know are familiar with some of his better known speeches and writings. For instance, the I Have a Dream speech and the letter from a Birmingham jail. Those are the ones that come to mind. Most of us have heard passages from those. But I never came across his Nobel lecture until I happened to see a quote, and this is while I was researching a talk I did sometime last year, but I saw this quote. It was on one of those Facebook internet memes, I guess they call them. And I'm sure you all know the first thing that I do when I come across a quote like that. I check it out to make sure that it's real, because there are so many bogus quotes that get passed off as real without any questions, and I don't want to be one of those to forward that stuff on. For example, we have this one here. Everything is energy, and that's all there is to it. Match the frequency of the reality you want, and you cannot help but get that reality. It can be no other way. This is not philosophy, this is physics, and that's attributed to Albert Einstein. And you see, I see this thing all over the place. And so of course, the question that Albert wants to know is, did I really say that? And the answer is nope. It's a fake quote. It first appeared in the year 2000 on a website where you have this New Age guru who claims to be channeling this alien entity. You can't find anything in any of Einstein's original material, and believe me, they have all that stuff. You can't find anything of him saying it, so I can just say that it pays to be careful because it pays to be careful because we have to separate the diamonds from the lumps of coal. So this is the Martin Luther King quote that I found that got me onto the Nobel lecture. He said, "Every nation must now develop an overriding loyalty to mankind as a whole in order to preserve the best in our individual societies." It's real. I checked it out. It's real. It was part of his Nobel lecture back in 1964. And when I found it, I read the rest of the lecture. And you can find it too. Just look up Martin Luther King Nobel lecture. It's not that long. I read the whole thing, and it was beautiful. It was just jaw-dropping, and I knew that someday I was going to have to get into it in a little more detail. And I think now's the time, because the words that he spoke back then in 1964 are still completely relevant today. We've made progress. There's no denying that, but he had a diagnosis and a prescription which still holds true right now. So here's what he said. Every man lives in two realms, the internal and the external. The internal is that realm of spiritual ends expressed in art, literature, morals, and religion. The external is that complex of devices, techniques, mechanisms, and instrumentalities by means of which we live. Our problem today is that we have allowed the internal to become lost in the external. We have allowed the means by which we live to outdistance the ends for which we live. So much of modern life can be summarized in that arresting dictum of the poet Thoreau: improved means to an unimproved end. This is the serious predicament, the deep and haunting problem confronting modern man. If we are to survive today, our moral and spiritual lag must be eliminated. Enlarged material powers spell enlarged peril if there is not proportionate growth of the soul. When the without of man's nature subjugates the within, dark storm clouds begin to form in the world. Kind of a long quote, but I think worth sharing. He said that 53 years ago. Dark storm clouds. Do you know what the names of two of the top American Nazi websites are? You have the Stormfront and the Daily Stormer. Invoking the image of Nazi stormtroopers, invoking the image of the Blitz, which means lightning, part of a storm. And for some reason they decided that it was time to go marching in public once again. Dark storm clouds beginning to form in the world. Now the good news here is I think the evidence shows that they are a distinct minority. But then, how many does it take? And how did Dr. King know? Anyone who thinks that we live in a post-racial society are sadly mistaken. These people up here, they're serious. And this is now. I don't know about anyone else, but I feel a sense of revulsion when I see people with swastikas on flags in this country or marching in the year 2017 wearing Ku Klux Klan robes and hoods. And I refuse to use the term alt-right. That's a euphemism that's designed to sugarcoat the ugliness that they're really up to. So Dr. King gave the warning, and then he diagnosed the cause of the problem. He said this: the problem of spiritual and moral lag which constitutes modern man's chief dilemma, expresses itself in three larger problems which grow out of man's ethical infantilism. Each of these problems, while appearing to be separate and isolated, is inextricably bound to the other. I refer to racial injustice, poverty, and war. I love the way he uses words. Man's ethical infantilism. It takes honesty and courage to own that. And it's true. We are learning to listen, I think, more carefully to the better angels of our nature, as Abraham Lincoln put it. And we have miles to go yet, but progress has been made, and Dr. King spent a good chunk of his Nobel lecture back in 1964 outlining the very significant strides that had been made worldwide, not just in this country. He pointed out that in 1934, there were only 3 independent nations in the whole of Africa. By 1964, there were 35 independent African nations that escaped colonialism. And we should add India to that as well. Not in Africa, but another story of how that works. Of course, slavery in this country ended, not without a great struggle. And there was a gradual decline in segregation. Voting rights for African Americans were starting to be recognized and protected better. So there was indeed much to celebrate. And yet around the world, after 1964, government-enforced segregation, apartheid as they called it, that didn't end until 1991. In this country, it took until 1967 before it was legal for a black and a white person to get married. Before 1967, there were 16 states in which it was illegal, and I mean a felony, for a black and a white person to get married. It took a Supreme Court decision in 1967 to force the repeal of the laws in those last 16 states. I was 10 years old when that happened. I didn't know about it until sometime later. I couldn't believe it. And of course, that's what we call the public sector. In the private sector, the injustice of discrimination went on for much longer, and it still is, and I think that that's probably the place where it's entrenched the most. I recall very distinctly, when I was practicing law in Illinois, one of the big cases that I argued was a lawsuit that we brought against a local yacht club that was using public property, a public riverfront, to run their private club. They had this public land all tied up in a sweetheart deal with the city, and the public could not enjoy this public land. And so we brought a lawsuit against them. And we were shocked when we got copies of their bylaws, which restricted membership to white males. I might have said Christian at one time. That might have been one of the older sets, but this was 1988, restricted to white males. Now, private clubs can do pretty much what they want, and it's evidence of something that goes on in consciousness. They can do it, that doesn't make it right, and it's evidence of something that lingers in consciousness. As if anatomy and skin color determines whether or not you know how to dock a boat, for crying out loud. And the judge booted them out. And they literally had to take their brick clubhouse off the shore and shove it out onto a barge and move it down the river to some private property that they had purchased where they could continue to do what they wanted on their own property. I was kind of proud of that one. And just last month we had the Charlottesville incident, which demonstrates that there is this consciousness that lingers out there, showing us that we are still divided. It's a work in progress. And every now and then I see something on Facebook saying that anyone who talks about racism, they're the ones who are trying to divide us. And I have to laugh, because it's a perfect example of Orwellian double speak. The truth is that we've never been united. we've never been united. Progress has been made, but we are still divided. And the solution to that kind of injustice today is the same as what Dr. King did in the 60s. Nonviolent resistance. These guys need to stay home. They are playing right into the hands of the Nazis. They may as well be doing their bidding. If in the unlikely event that one day all hell breaks loose and a military solution is necessary for this resurgence in white nationalism, then they can join the military and they can punch all the Nazis they want. But until then, stay home. And I'm not making any kind of equivalency here. They didn't start the problem. The white supremacists did, but their response is not helpful. The focus should be on the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan and Nazis in America, not the dysfunctional response of those guys. Because as Dr. King observed, violence as a way of achieving racial justice is both impractical and immoral. I am not unmindful of the fact that violence often brings about momentary results. Nations have frequently won their independence in battle. But in spite of temporary victories, violence never brings permanent peace. And boy, did we learn that from the Civil War. It solves no social problem. It merely creates new and more complicated ones. Violence is impractical because it is a descending spiral ending in destruction for all. Violence is immoral because it thrives on hatred rather than love. Violence ends up defeating itself. It creates bitterness in the survivors and brutality in the destroyers. I think everyone would agree that World War II was a just war and that the result was overall good, at least in terms of liberating Europe, putting an end to the Holocaust. And yet after World War II, what happened? Well, that's how we got the modern Middle East, with all the problems that are going on there continuously. So as Dr. King said in that quote, violence never brings permanent peace. It solves no social problem. They just kind of go on, and we have to learn how to address them other ways. There is still a need for people to stand up to what we see starting to happen again. I look out at this and I think, haven't we been through this several times already? What is this? But it takes a lot of courage, because nonviolent resistance is not for the faint of heart. Anybody remember the movie Gandhi? He was another champion of nonviolence. There was this scene where the workers, people are out of work, they're going up to a salt factory that's been closed for political reasons, they want a job, and each one of Gandhi's followers walks up to the guards at the gate to demand work, and one by one they're clubbed by the guards, and they just keep coming, and they keep coming, and they keep coming. Gandhi's example was so effective, his nonviolent resistance was so effective that it succeeded in persuading England to leave India, to allow India to have its independence. Then we had the scene at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Alabama in 1965, the year after Dr. King's speech. Unarmed protesters being beaten, gassed, chewed up by police dogs, and there are a lot more examples of nonviolent resistance and the courage that it takes to do that. You get the idea. Some people may think or may say that nonviolence is weak, passive, wimpy. But when I recall those scenes, those are the last words that come to mind for me. It requires the courage of a warrior and a high degree of emotional intelligence and self-awareness to keep the anger in check. Oh, you can bet it's there. You got to keep the anger in check, face the fear, and still keep moving. That is very difficult. I don't know that I would be up to that challenge. So when it comes to justice and nonviolence, the measure of success isn't necessarily a world where there are absolutely no manifestations of injustice or physical violence. Gandhi warned us that not all forms of violence and injustice can be totally eliminated. So thinking that we can totally eliminate them is a sure setup for failure, and that kind of failure leads to cynicism And I think we have enough cynicism in the world already. So we need to find a better measure of success for the principles of peace and nonviolence. And I just happen to have an example here this morning which comes to us from the German town of Wunsiedel. This is a town that became a pilgrimage site for Nazis because Rudolf Hess, the infamous Rudolf Hess, used to be buried there. All right, it got to be so bad they come and march every year. And there was hundreds of them that would march every year because Rudolf Hess was buried there. So what they thought they'd do is they would exhume him and move the body someplace else. I wonder if anybody accused them of erasing history. So they exhumed him, they moved him, but the Nazis kept coming back year after year. And this is what the townspeople did in response.
Wunsiedel in Upper Franconia, a small town with a big problem, a Nazi problem. Because for over 25 years, each year, hundreds of right-wing extremists have been coming here to march through Wunsiedel. The town feels helpless. That's why everything's a little different in 2014, because we've secretly turned this Nazi march into something sensible, Germany's most involuntary walkathon. The idea that every meter the neo-Nazis march, 10 euros go to an exit program aimed at undermining precisely these neo-Nazis. Exit Deutschland. The further they march, the more money is collected. In other words, with every step they take, the neo-Nazis campaign against neo-Nazis and unwittingly finance more and more defections from the extremist scene. And the best thing is, they only find out when they're already marching. At 1:48 p.m. on the dot, the Nazis Against Nazis campaign officially gets underway. For the first time in history, neo-Nazis are marching against themselves. In keeping with the walkathon, motivational posters and banners encourage the participants to keep going and make sure they don't forget what they're marching for, or rather, against. Markings on the road let the stony-faced participants keep track of how much money they've collected. And thought has been given to the right-wing radicals' fitness too. Bananas are being handed out as sustenance, so that even the most unfit neo-fascists will manage to goose-step their way across the finish line in this donation run. At 3:28 p.m, the neo-fascists have reached their goal. 10,000 euros for the neo-Nazi opt-out initiative, Exit Deutschland. 10,000 euros to help right-wing extremists safely defect from the right-wing extremist scene, personally collected by right-wing extremists. Thank you to all the helpers and sponsors. Thank you to the neo-Nazis for collecting donations. Thank you for the miracle of Wunsiedel. Wunsiedel in Upper Franconia, a small town with a big idea.
What do you think? By the way, the reason you didn't see any swastikas in that march is because it is illegal in Germany to display a swastika. They don't have the same First Amendment protections that we have here, so you can't do it. But make no mistake, they were Nazis. Brilliant, don't you think? And I understand that they're still marching, but they've dwindled down to nothing, from hundreds down to a handful, basically. And they still raise money for a good cause. Hey, every goose step they take, we raise money to fight hate. That's kind of catchy, but every goose step they take, we raise money to fight hate. I'd like to see something like that happen here. I think that's another way to measure our success. We need to stay positive, creative, and optimistic, and not give in to cynicism and anger when we see that kind of thing happening. And then maybe we'll just start to see that kind of consciousness that we saw in Houston begin to cancel out the kind of stuff that we saw in Charlottesville. Next Sunday, our chaplains are going to be doing something special for the World Day of Prayer, and then after that we'll continue with some of the other points raised by Dr. King, and I hope you can join us for the rest of the series. Thank you.